Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute.
Anybody have a sheet of paper? There's no public comment sheet up there for people to sign in.
We're just going to do this.
We're just going to do it like we did last time and let people come up.
This is fun. You guys all gotta get with it.
That's how we did it last time.
All right. Good evening, everyone. We're going to come to order. Welcome to the second public forum of the Charter Review Committee. Thank you all for being here. We'll go ahead and just dive right in, I think. We'll start with some introductions. My name is Jacqueline Matz. I'm the chair of this committee. I'll let other committee members introduce themselves, starting to my right.
My name is Michael Moscato.
I'm Rebecca Setner.
Drew Lerman.
Also with us is Nancy Lively, who takes fantastic minutes.
Jeannie.
We have Jonah Spivak, the town's communications coordinator, running our slideshow. And behind the camera is Mike Cutler from CAT TV, and many members of the public in attendance, which is wonderful. So additional members of our committee that are not here tonight include Colleen McQuaid, Carolyn Gilbert, and the late Jim Vyers. We're here tonight to share the work that we've taken so far and the recommendations that we're likely to make in the coming week or two to the Select Board. So we've been evaluating the charges that were given us by the Select Board for the past 4 months or so. In that time, we've interviewed about 30 different stakeholders. We've received over 20 public comments. In all, members of our committee have committed over 500 hours of work in the past 4 months to come to the recommendations that we'll be presenting. Our focus has been to thoroughly evaluate these recommendations and determine if they're viable for Bennington, if these recommendations would potentially serve the public interest, and if there would be any major pitfalls to them being implemented in Bennington. We've given consideration to the many different opinions that exist in Bennington on many of these issues, and as best as possible, we've tried to withhold our own opinions and judgments in looking at these issues, and as best we could try to evaluate them on a factual basis. So we'll dive into the specific recommendations that we think will move forward. But before we do that, we'll just offer an overview of what happens after this forum tonight. So our next meeting will be on November 15th. That's this Friday. We'll potentially have one final meeting on November 22nd. At those two meetings, one or two meetings, we'll have a final approval of the report that we present to the Select Board. We'll present to the Select Board likely on November 25th. At that time, the Select Board will sort of take charge of the process. They'll look at the recommendations that we've made. They'll make any adjustments that they think are appropriate. They might reject some of our recommendations. And then what's what they approve of or with any amendments that they make will move forward to be placed on the town ballot in March. Before they're placed on the ballot in March, there will be 2 public forums. The dates are here, January 27th and February 10th. This is another opportunity for the public to come and voice their opinions to the Select Board. You'll have an opportunity then to vote on March 4th on Town Voting Day. Any recommendations that are approved by the town voters will move forward to the state legislature, who again has the ability to approve or reject or amend any of the recommendations. And anything that passes both the legislature and the governor's approval will then move forward on the process of being implemented in the town, which can also be a lengthy process depending on the specifics of the recommendation. So there may be a long road ahead for some of these recommendations, even if they do succeed through the entire process. We'll go through each of our recommendations tonight, and then we'll give the public in attendance an opportunity to come and share their perspectives, ask some questions. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but our goal here is to just share the information that we relied on to make our recommendations. We'll go ahead and get started with our first recommendation, and I'll turn this over to Mike Moscato.
Thank you, Jackie. I was once told not to bury the lead, so we'll get right into it. Our charter committee proposes the following charter changes to the town charter. The first change being to lower the voting age for municipal elections to include 16 and 17-year-olds. And the second change is to allow legal residents of Bennington who are non-U.S. citizens to vote in municipal elections. So the question that we want to address with our proposals is, how did we get to those proposals? And I want to start in this particular topic with the vision statement of the town of Bennington. The vision statement of the town of Bennington reads, "Bennington is a welcoming, engaged, inclusive, and resilient community where everyone, regardless of identity, shares in our vitality and benefits from an outstanding quality of life." We as a committee believe that these charter changes allow the residents of Bennington an opportunity to define who we are as a town. When I was trying to think of how I would go about talking about these issues tonight, one approach is to talk about the morality, to talk about the difficulties that our youth today face, how growing up sooner and faster than the generation before them seems to be the case these days. To talk about stories of fathers and mothers risking their lives for a chance at a Monday like the rest of us. But part of this process involves the input of the public. And it would be doing a disservice to this community if we strictly based our proposals off of our own personal feelings, our attachments, our emotions. One of the things that came up constantly in the public comment, which we greatly appreciate, is the legality. The majority of feedback that we received focused on the United States Constitution, on federal law, on a belief that non-citizens would not be allowed to vote, on a belief that only 18 and older should vote. So this committee took a deep dive into both federal law and state law when considering these recommendations. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, federal law, it states, Section A, it shall be unlawful for any alien to vote in any election held solely or in part for the purpose of electing a candidate for the office of President, Vice President, Presidential Elector, Member of the Senate, Member of the House of Representatives, Delegate from the District of Columbia, or Resident Commissioner unless, 1, the The election is held partly for some other purpose. 2, aliens are authorized to vote for such other purpose under a state constitution or a local ordinance. And 3, voting for such other purpose is conducted independently of voting for a candidate for such federal offices in such a manner that an alien has the opportunity to vote for such other purpose, but not an opportunity to vote for a candidate for any one or more other such federal offices. In looking at federal law, it was determined that the state or local ordinance could help define this issue. So we then looked at the state level. In the case Ferry versus the City of Montpelier, did I get that right, Jackie? In 2023, the Vermont Supreme Court ruled that a municipal government's charter provision allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections did not violate the Vermont Constitution. So as a committee, we looked at federal law, we looked at state law, and we relied on our meetings with town council. And it was determined that not only was there precedent for non-citizen voting throughout the country, as our report will detail, but there was precedent at the state level, as our report will detail, and the legalities of the opportunity for this town are in our hands. And that's ultimately why we decided to move forward with that decision. We met with various leaders, as Jackie said. We took into consideration the very real complexities politically, at the town level, at the operations level of elections. And ultimately, what I can't stress enough is that we were very cautious to avoid generalities. And by that I mean, every 16 and 17-year-old is not the same. There are single parents who are 16 years old. There are 16-year-olds who go to work every single day to support their families, to support their parents, to support their children. There are 17-year-olds who do the same. There are kids younger than that. There are people who have been in situations where their lives were uprooted in the places that they have come from. They have been vetted beyond belief, and they are here in this town. So the question that we asked and that we felt very comfortable is bringing these proposals to the town. And I would ask the members of this town that if we can establish that we are not breaking federal law, if we can establish that we are not breaking state law, if this is truly a unique opportunity for us as a town to craft what we believe in as a town, and as I read the mission statement for the town, then we feel comfortable presenting these proposals to the town so that ultimately the voices of the people of Bennington can be heard and the decision will be made, assuming the select board brings it to that point. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jackie.
Thank you. The next set of recommendations concerns addressing blighted and vacant properties in town. I'll let Rebecca Sentner speak on that issue.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share these recommendations, as Jackie said, for housing and properties. I think that most people would agree that affordable, quality housing and a vibrant downtown area are important elements of a thriving community. Unfortunately, in Bennington right now, housing for sale and for rent is scarce, and there are, numerous commercial properties in the downtown vicinity that are either vacant or underutilized. And that really, for us, was like the crux of the matter brought before us and where we really wanted to make a difference. So we considered a lot of various tools that the town, the state, the courts, and even the private sector had at their disposal to act as either deterrents or incentives to foster higher occupancy rates in Bennington. And after a lot of research, what became really clear to us is that many of the solutions were outside the jurisdiction of a town charter, that they would really better be placed in an ordinance, in a state statute, in a town-level initiative, or even in a public-private partnership agreement. However, there was one challenge that came up in our research that pertaining to vacant properties, the municipal lien subordination, that we felt a potential change in the charter could actually address. Currently, in the town of Bennington, if the town puts a lien on a property for a code violation, the town's lien is considered only after the mortgage holders, which is considered the senior lien. This means that the financial institutions, if the financial institution's lien goes into foreclosure, the town's lien is wiped out. So there's no ability for the town to recuperate any lost costs associated with that property. Interestingly, what we found was this was not the case for tax violations or water sewer liens. And in those cases, the town's lien does supersede. Of course, when we learned this, little light bulbs went out off the top of our heads, and we started thinking. And that led us to this recommendation, to elevate the priority of municipal code violation liens to the same status as the tax and water sewer liens. And this would allow those liens to supersede the mortgage liens. It would allow the town to recoup any cost associated that might be necessary to be taken against that property to resolve the situation. Okay, so I don't know if how many people here were at the first public forum that we held, or maybe watched it on TV. But I had made a point at the time to talk about how important public input was to this committee and this process. And I just want to reiterate again how important all of the feedback that we got was to our decisions and to the entire process. And the next recommendation, I think, is a great example of that. We've received a public comment suggesting we consider an additional 1% local option tax for short-term rentals. Now, this wasn't exactly part of the charge given to the committee by the select board to reduce the number of long-term vacant properties, but the suggestion really intrigued us, and we looked into it. And what we found was that in the charter, there is already a local options tax, and that rooms tax was included under that, and that short-term rentals would fall under that. But that would extend beyond short-term rentals. And so what we learned was, in order to carve out short-term rentals, there would have to be a change in the charter. And so we thought about that, and we came to the conclusion that the town would actually benefit from this in several ways. First, it would help to ensure that the property owners who profit from these kinds of rentals fairly contribute back to the local economy, similar to any traditional business. The tax would also act as a measure to mitigate the negative effects of non-owner occupied short-term rentals and what they can have on neighborhoods, such as rising rents or housing shortages, or even just that loss of like a community feel. And just to reiterate also, we really we're looking at these non-owner occupied short-term rentals. These are like the types that you would find up on an Airbnb kind of site where the owner of the property is not here, doesn't live in this town or doesn't live in that location, and it sits empty in between those rentals. And by imposing a 1% tax, we thought the town could help balance the economic benefits of short-term rentals like this with the need to maintain a sustainable and livable community for its residents. And with that, I will hand it back to Jackie.
Thank you, Rebecca. Our next recommendation is on the topic of town governance, specifically to do with employment arrangements for the town manager. Drew Lerman will review that recommendation.
Thank you, Jackie. I don't think I'll be quite as entertaining as the other speakers, but I was involved with the governance piece as well as the other ones. But the overview on the governance piece was to review the duties, responsibilities, and the term limits of the select board and the town manager. And we were focusing on the areas that were being considered were term limits for the select board and maybe the chair and co-chair positions as well. We looked at a formal employment agreement with the town manager as part of that. And when the town manager position becomes open, should there be a national search for a replacement? And a group met with with representatives from the town. We met with the town clerk, we met with Cassie, we met with the select board chair, Jeannie, and we met with Stu, and we met with Dan, and we met with the town attorney was involved as well, Merrill Bent. So we met with them, and I have to tell you, I really appreciated for the group, all of them, all of their candor and the information that they shared and the historical perspective. It helped kind of guide the group of what areas to focus in on and what areas to not focus in on. We didn't want to spend time on things that we felt the select board wouldn't approve or the legislature wouldn't approve once it got up there. So we looked at the one clause, which was 103.406A of the town charter, and that is around the discretion of the select board to offer an employment agreement when they're looking for the recruitment for a town manager. They have the option to do that. The select board has the option to do that now. This is just adding some verbiage into that 103.406A that basically says that they may, unless modified by an employment contract, deal with the reserve powers the select board has as far as being the town manager being an at-will employee and with 90 days notice. A lot of the, at least in the experience of that some of us have had in the corporate world, an employment agreement is not unusual to offer when you're looking for that type of position. It doesn't have to be a long-term agreement. It just has to be an agreement. A lot of people refer to them basically as severance agreements. But that's kind of where we homed in on, and that's the recommendation that we're going to make to the select board in our final report.
Thank you, Joe.
All right.
Our last recommendation comes as a result of our review of the fourth charge given to this committee from the Select Board. That charge was to evaluate charter changes to increase the autonomy of the Community Policing Advisory Review Board. You'll notice that the Advisory Review Board is not mentioned on this slide, and I'll explain that momentarily. In evaluating this charge, our committee began by seeking to understand sort of the history of the Community Policing Advisory Review Board. I'll just call them CPORB going forward. So the history of their creation and their work to date. So we looked at the Safety and Equity Task Force from circa 2021 that recommended the creation of a community advisory board. Some of the recommendations from that Safety and Equity Task Force include conducting reviews free from any external influences and control, assuring a way for all citizens to have a method of lodging a complaint other than directly through the Bennington Police Department, review process and outcome of complaints, including looking at records, body-worn camera footage, interviewing witnesses or other actions to gain a full understanding of what happened, and to develop a clear process and timetable for reviewing and investigating these matters. We then looked at the resolution that the Select Board adopted creating CPORB, which laid out a similar set of goals. And we reached out to the officers, the currently seated officers of CPORB, and asked them to come and have a conversation with us to understand the work that they'd undertaken so far. So we met with them. Several members of this committee met with the officers of that board. And we learned that there were a lot of challenges that they were facing in getting the data that they needed to have a meaningful review of any of these policing matters. They don't have resources to gather comparative data from other towns. They don't have power to receive specific data from the police department. There's some misunderstanding or some miscommunication around which data they do have access to. And largely what we found is that that board is working really hard to connect with members of our community and to offer a community perspective to the police department. But a lot of the measurable outcomes, a lot of the measurable goals that are laid forth in the resolution creating the CPORB board are things that are sort of outside of their ability to act on and accomplish because of some of the legal barriers around looking at, for example, policing records and body-worn camera footage. One of the other things that came out of our conversation with CPORB members is that they felt internally that there's sort of a lack of resources that they would want to be able to rely upon to be able to make informed decisions on policy matters or to evaluate whether certain policing activities fall within or outside of sort of accepted norms for policing behavior. And there was a lot of discouragement on that board where they really wanted to do a good job, right, to accomplish a lot of the goals that were laid out for them. And they felt frustrated. What we heard is that they felt frustrated that they weren't able to make more progress on those matters. Following that, we had a conversation with representatives from the Bennington Police Department. The chief law enforcement officer of the town, Chief Doucette, shared that he was really satisfied so far with the relationship that he had been able to develop with the CPORB board. He was enthusiastic about working with them. He indicated to us that he had some data available for them, but that they had not requested that data. And he acknowledged that there was some challenges around training members of that board, that members of that board need to pass certain security clearances because they receive police-style training, and that there were just additional challenges on the side of the police department with divulging confidential records, things of that nature. We also spoke with some members of the community that continued to express a desire for the same recommendations that had originally been laid out by the Safety and Equity Task Force, a meaningful review of policing conduct, complaints, and compliments. We attended a recent CPORB meeting where a representative from the police department presented several complaints that had been submitted. The chief presented sort of their review of the complaints with no specific information about what had happened. So everything was anonymized. It was a brief verbal report And members of the CPOR board then had an opportunity to ask a few questions. And as far as we could tell from attending that meeting, that was the extent of the review of those complaints conducted by the CPOR board. We then looked at what other states and communities had done around this matter, and if there was legislative precedent in Vermont, as well as sort of some research on community advisory boards broadly, and sort of what makes the difference between an effective board and one that kind of just squanders the time of the people that participate on those boards. And out of this, we came up with this one recommendation. So our committee heard clearly from members of CPORB that that board didn't feel like they were qualified to exercise any sort of subpoena power or ability to look at confidential policing records. We, excuse me, through our process here as well, but I think also broadly, I think we've chosen to place a lot of trust in our electoral process, in the voters, and in our elected officials, specifically the select board, and to exercise some of these abilities, with these authorities, these powers, with a degree of prudence, right? So rather than granting an authority like this directly to a specific board, our committee felt more comfortable recommending that the select board have the authority to grant another board. So our recommendation is that the select board has the ability to delegate some external body, some subordinate town body, the ability to look at some confidential police records. So this would allow for a real evidence-based review of policing matters. The confidential records would remain confidential. They would not become public record because this body takes a look at them. And it allows the select board to retain some control over this process and some flexibility in when and to whom this privilege would be granted. Additionally, this committee felt very clearly that the police chief should retain the final say in any disciplinary matters. So this would not grant a subordinate body any power to impose discipline, only to look at body-worn camera footage, personnel records, and make recommendations to the chief based on their analysis of those documents. Our report will contain some additional recommendations on many of these topics that do not require a charter change, but nonetheless that we believe are considerations that the select board should make, that we came across in the course of looking at potential charter changes, that we said, here's an idea that we think could be helpful for Bennington, but we don't need to put this in the charter, but we'll just put it in our report. And again, we'll trust the select board to go ahead and make further evaluations on those issues. I do want to clarify one additional recommendation, or non-recommendation, if you will, that doesn't appear on the slides because our committee is not making that recommendation, but it did sort of come to the end of our process and was one of 7 recommendations that we considered strongly, but then ultimately decided not to proceed with. That last recommendation was one for all-mail voting in Bennington, where for municipal elections, all residents would receive a mail-in ballot. On discussion with the town clerk, we learned that this would really complicate the process of sending out ballots and would likely be really confusing to voters who would receive a ballot for municipal elections, but then would also have to go in person to vote on school board elections. And so on the basis that a lot of voters would potentially not realize that then they had to go vote in two places, we decided that that was not worth moving forward. So those are the 6 recommendations that have come out of our 4 months of review of this process. We understand that many of these recommendations are controversial and people have strong opinions on many of these issues. And we've heard many of those opinions, and we really appreciate all of that input that we've received from the public. In talking through making many of these recommendations, it's been at the front of our mind that these recommendations will be placed on a town ballot for approval by the town voters, assuming they make it through the select board. We've talked about that. And that sort of has guided a lot of the recommendations that we've made because we think that these are matters that are that could be implemented, that the voters of Bennington deserve to have a collective conscience heard on those matters. We've certainly heard a lot of strong opinions from members of the public, but we remain aware that there's a lot of people we haven't heard from that live in this town and also have a right to have their voice heard on these matters. And so it's largely on that basis that our committee voted unanimously on all 6 of these issues. In fact, on all 7 of them, voted affirmatively on the 6 that you see presented here, and to reject the one that you do not see here. So I think that really speaks to the thorough review and analysis that this committee has done, that all 7 of these votes were unanimous across our committee. So it's our sincere hope that these recommendations improve the lives of the people who live in Bennington and the efficiency and operation of town government. But we certainly understand that people are entitled to their opinions on all of these issues. At this time, we'd invite you to share those opinions. As well as I mentioned before, feel free to ask any questions. I think all of us up here will be happy to share some of our perspective and maybe clarify anything that wasn't clear. But again, we've tried to remain pretty factual in how we've evaluated these issues, understanding that everybody has strong opinions on these matters. So we don't have a sign-up sheet, so you can feel free to sort of come up to the microphone. We do ask that you state your name, keep your comments to about 3 minutes. I don't have a timekeeper tonight, but maybe we could figure that out quickly. And please, open to you.
Not all at once, please.
Shirley Adams, I live here in Bennington. Could you give us some more detail about the voting recommendation? I remember at the last meeting there was some discussion about what 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds or legal residents, non-citizens would be able to vote for. Is it all inclusive? Could you just talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So part of part of the consideration in terms of the state is that what you can vote for, you can also be elected to. With 16 and 17-year-olds, the school process, the range of here in Bennington in terms of the reach of our school system reaches outside of the Bennington realm, and therefore 16 and 17-year-olds would not be allowed to vote on school matters. They would be only able to vote on issues of the town. So that was one thing that we did seek clarity on and provided us some insight in regards to that. For instance,
That also applies to non-citizen
Correct.
residents.
correct. In terms of non-citizens, I felt we made this abundantly clear at the first forum, but I feel like I skipped over it on this forum. We only considered legal residents. If you are not a legal resident, there was no consideration given to being able to participate to vote. And so certain groups, such as refugees, were mentioned previously. We're talking about people who are here in the United States legally, and they are residents of the town of Bennington legally. And that is who is considered in regards to non-citizen voting and in regards to your question, 16 and 17-year-olds.
I would follow up on that as well by mentioning that we did look at whether an undocumented person might try to vote. One of the factors that I think really turned the corner for our committee on this recommendation was learning that the state's election management system, where voters are entered, is about to be updated to accommodate 16 and 17-year-old voters and non-citizen residents. So there will be a verification process that exists. We also learned through our conversations with other towns who have adopted non-citizen resident voting, that in those towns, undocumented people don't try to vote by virtue of the fact that they wish to remain undocumented, and they prefer not to have their information show up on a list. And so those towns have found that that's not a challenge that they've had to deal with.
Good evening, Clerk Adams, Bennington. Thank you, folks, for the good work you did. I have a couple of questions. The items, the charges you have here, I know you received significant input from the public with various recommendations for charter issues. Doesn't appear that what you've posted here vary from the charge that was issued by the Select Board. So my concern is large numbers of people in the public had concerns that don't seem to have made it onto the cut, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you may want to address that. And to slide into a parochial, selfish part of my question, one of the things I was concerned about is when I was sworn in, I was stunned when I was sworn in. I thought, is that all there is? I've taken the oath of office on many occasions dealing with my military service. And the one thing that struck me as odd was there was no reference to the United States Constitution or even the state of Vermont Constitution as part of my oath. But interestingly enough, the state legislature in their oath references the Constitution. So I was a little taken aback that someone could be sworn into office without acknowledging their dedication to the base document of this country, and that is the Constitution. No matter what we say or do here, if it's not along with the Constitution, it's, in my mind, invalid. So I don't understand how that element could be ignored. But again, thank you for your hard work.
Thank you, Clerk. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I really appreciate your comment there. In our final report, we do have all of the public comments that we've received and our responses to them. And in many situations, we saw the validity of the comment, but had determined that it wasn't something that that belonged in a town charter, that it possibly could be handled through other means in a more efficient way. And so we've included that in our comments, and Jackie kind of referenced that in her notes, that we have included recommendations that weren't charter changes or charter amendments, but are potential things that could be taken up by the select board and implemented. So there are more recommendations within the report that we didn't share. We only, and in this presentation, shared the ones that would be for the town charter itself. And there were, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and all of the comments that we received, there is a response, and it details what we looked into, what our response is to, or how to handle the recommendation that we received. A lot of the recommendations were also in support of the charges. Like, we're directly, I would say a majority of them were in regards to the charges that were put in front of this committee.
Did you have something, Joe?
Yeah, I was just going to add that there was, I think I may have mentioned it in my report too, is that if we did discuss a lot of the public comments, and we did approach a lot of those public comments with people that we did research and interviewed with. And even though you don't see it on the screen tonight, in the final report, you'll see all of the reasons why those public comments were treated the way they were, or answered the way they were. Part of it may have been, to some respect, a fact that we didn't think the select board was going to go for it, or there was votes in the past that have already addressed the issue unanimously and didn't think it was going to go anywhere. So there was, every public comment was discussed, and it's on the, it's probably the first part of the agenda of every meeting we've had, and everyone was answered in the final document.
Clark, you mentioned specifically a comment relating to taking of oaths, swearing of oaths to the Constitution on taking office. We did discuss that issue specifically with town council and looked at whether that would be likely to pass through the legislature if it conflicted with an existing oath. It appears that there is in I believe the state constitution already an oath for elected officials to take, and so having an additional oath or a different oath that specifically mentions the U.S. Constitution would be in conflict with that existing legislation, and so that seemed like there was already an oath that was required to be taken by elected officials, and trying to change that, I think the committee felt we didn't really understand where that would really improve the operation of town government.
Get on up here, Mike.
I'm sure you guys all, God bless you, you've done the best you can and you meant well, but
Your name, please.
I'm totally disappointed. All the months that you've spent doing this, there isn't anything really in the app in there that's, I guess this is all going to be on the ballot to vote on the charter change? These things are all going to be to vote on, each one of them?
We don't know. That depends on the select board.
Okay, so the select board can drop them, can the select board add things to them
Yes.
instead of this?
Yep.
And how does that process start if somebody wants the select board to add something to this or replace some of these things?
So my understanding is that charter recommendations don't actually have to begin with a charter review committee. This is a sort of a mechanism that our town has agreed upon to have a regular review of the town charter. But outside of our regular review of the town charter, residents can bring suggestions to the select board at any time, and the select board can choose to place those items on any municipal ballot on town voting day. So if, say, in 2 years, somebody has a strong idea for a charter amendment, it's not necessary to wait for the next charter review committee. That process can begin at any time.
So somebody could suggest something currently, and it could be on this charter change?
I believe
this
that's
year?
correct, yes.
All right. And again, I meant no offense to any of this. You're all very nice people, and anybody in town would probably love to have you as neighbors or something like that. But I don't know, I just see a lot of far-left agenda items here that just drive me nuts. And I don't see anything that is really the common person in Bennington is going to benefit by or probably even want. And I wish more people were here tonight to say what they would like to see in the charter. And one last thing, as far as the town manager goes, you got to be very careful that you don't put something in law that our town can't work with to find the next town manager. And I like Stu Hurd very much, and I want him to stay as long as he wants, but we could get into a mess with, we can put anything we want in our town charter. If we go for a big search and the people out there say, no, because it's in your town charter, we're not going to do that or that, we need to be pliable, because anybody coming here from outside is going to want a contract, a 5-year contract with money, maybe money to move here. So I don't think you can lock something in just because you put something in the charter. And but I do appreciate your work, and God bless all of us.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your perspective. I guess I'd like to say that this committee chose to focus on the charges that we were given by the select board, and those topics were quite broad and really took up all of our time. We really endeavored to spend some additional time, whatever we could, on comments that came in through the form on our website, through our meetings, but you know, and I think there's a number of changes that we would have explored more and evaluated further if the time had been there to do that. But I think the committee understood that we were asked to look at specific things, and looking at those specific items really took the bulk of the time that had been allotted to us. So if there's a recommendation that didn't make it on here, there's a good chance that that's just because we didn't have time to investigate that change fully. You spoke of being careful with sort of agreements with town manager and a potential national search, those types of things. I think that is a perspective that was shared by our committee. We wanted to be careful not to limit the select board's latitude in this area. We were advised by council that the current charter provision that allows for the town manager to be dismissed without cause on 90 days' notice was the sort of the controlling ruling in Bennington. That is how the town manager in Bennington is an at-will employee, because that's what it says in the charter. So that is the case in Bennington. But one of the considerations that we made was that when Stu does move on, next year, 10 years, whatever that is, and the next town manager has to be hired by the select board, if there is a national search, depending on market conditions, it might be challenging to entice somebody to move to Bennington or to take that position if it remains an at-will position. So council suggested that that there was likely already, that the select board likely already had the authority to offer a contract to a town manager, but we wanted to really clarify and be clear that the select board does have that ability. So adding the phrase "unless modified by contract" allows the select board to exercise either option when it comes time to replace the town manager.
Can I have a follow-up on that?
Sure.
When you say the at-will part of this, isn't the state an at-will employee? Isn't that the law of the state, that you don't need to have an excuse to fire somebody? And if you had a contract with somebody, you would probably have to buy out that contract or pay that contract. But as far as an at-will, we can always keep that because that's a state law anyway.
Thank you, Mike. I believe, and I'm speaking a little out of pocket here, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this one, that Vermont is an at-will state, broadly speaking. But in terms of municipal employees, I don't believe municipal employees are generally at will. There generally does have to be cause for dismissal for municipal employees. When looking at this issue, it occurred to us that it's specified in the town charter that the town manager is an at-will employee. So that's a departure from otherwise what state law would be. So were that provision not in the charter, then the town manager would not be an at-will employee. But because it's in the charter, the town manager is an at-will employee. We chose to leave that provision in the charter, but then also give the select board the ability to override that with an employment contract.
One more and I'll leave you alone.
Thank you.
Thank you for leaving you alone. Don't you think you ought to really search that out before you even put it up to the voter? Because it could get the next select board or the select boards after that in some deep trouble legally. Which one is the priority, the state or our local charter?
We did clarify with council, and I believe the select board, during their due diligence, would also confirm that that's the case with town council.
Thank you.
A couple things additionally, Mike, that I wanted to add to that. The specificity of what we put in our town charter, as was communicated to us, also helps clarify the standing of our charter amongst the ranks of legality. But one thing I want to make as clear as a more general response to some of the things you brought up, Mike, was in everything that we did as a committee, there were two real questions that we answered in great depth amongst all of us. And the first was, could this be done in the town charter? And that's where the research came in, and that's where the discussions and the interviews and just the hours really were poured into at the beginning. And then the second component, after we found out whether or not something could be done, was answering whether or not something should be done. And part of our discussion about what should be done is what Jackie and our other committee members have alluded to, which is one of the questions is, should these questions be posed to the voters of Bennington? Should the people of Bennington, the Benningtonians, should you have the ability to show up at the polls and answer these questions yourselves, instead of having things decided for you? And that, to me, as a member of this committee, is one of the most beautiful things of being put in this position, is that this is a real opportunity for all of us as members of this community to decide on the charges that were provided to us as a committee. This isn't an overriding committee that, is dropping a hammer and saying this is exactly what needs to be done. We are, in fact, posing these questions to each and every voter in this town should the select board push those forward. And that is our interpretation of how our government works. And as a final example that I'll give you is that it is not, in terms of voting, as an example, we were not tasked, nor do we have the depth to decide what an American is. That is defined by various legal documents, discussion, recourse. But here, we have the opportunity to define what a Benningtonian is. And that is part of the charge that we looked at in terms of if you are a resident, if you are a legal resident, do the fellow citizens of Bennington recognize you, a legal resident, as an equal? And that was one of the questions that we want the members of this town to decide. And that is why we've put forth these proposals, whether it's about taxation, whether it's about voting, whether it's about board powers. We've tried to keep powers to the select board because those are the people who have been voted in by the people. And these questions that were put to us as a committee, we're trying our best to allow the citizens of Bennington, the residents of Bennington, to address themselves. So, thank you.
This is kind of a technical question. Shirley Adams, Bennington, and maybe you have an answer, maybe you don't. My understanding is that each item will be placed separately on the ballot and we'll vote individually. I'm just wondering how much of an explanation goes with each yay or nay vote. I mean, like the voting is a good one. You know, if somebody just did that one-line thing that you had on the slide there, they may have a misconception of what they're really voting on, and I'm just wondering what the verbiage is actually going to be on the ballot and who creates that verbiage.
Thank you, Shirley. The one thing that I'm clear on is that the full text of any charter language will be on the ballot. What I don't know is whether there's additional explanatory language that accompanies that. This committee has not provided explanatory language for those charter amendments. We were not asked to. Town council, my understanding is town council will be the one that drafts the specific charter language. That's legal language, right? But I think to your point, that's, some people might find that challenging to understand and interpret. I think that's part of the reason we're here tonight, is to, as best we can, explain in layman's terms the specifics of the recommendations that we're making to the select board. I would be happy to let somebody else add to the information that I've just provided, but my understanding is that the full language of charter changes will appear on the ballot. Okay, nothing like dead air.
Can I ask a question about town manager? What are you waiting?
I don't think that's charter related.
No, I don't think it was appropriate, and I apologize to Mr. Bird.
Are there other questions or comments on the charter recommendations? All right, then we will conclude this meeting.
One more slide to direct people who are not here tonight in case they would like to comment.
Yes, thank you, Jonah. So we'll conclude this meeting a little early then. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will meet November 15th for sure, and potentially November 22nd as well if we need that additional time. And we will likely be presenting our final report to the Select Board on November 25th. The comment form on the website for public comments that are directed to this committee will be closing soon. The slide says tonight, but I think probably we'll leave that up actually until Friday morning. And then on Friday morning, we'll receive any additional comments that have come in, but our committee is at the point where we're wrapping up our work, and so we won't have an opportunity to respond to comments that come in after that point, so we're just going to go ahead and close that comment form. That QR code up on the slide does still direct to the site, where if you are have a burning desire to submit a last-minute comment, you're welcome to do so. We'd like to thank so many people that were involved and supportive through this process. Many of them I see here in this room tonight, but most especially members of the public who shared with us their perspectives and their opinions and their insights and their hopes and their dreams and their visions for the future of Bennington. It's really been sort of at the center of our work. I understand that not all of the additional suggestions were able to fall within the scope of time that we were given, but we really appreciate the input nevertheless. And I hope that is evident in the report that we will release, where we've responded specifically to each piece of comment that we received. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening.